worked with fellow Janae Desmond Harris, who is now at the New York Times, and we put together a day-long seminar on bias, blind spots, and building better stories. Now, this is an all-day seminar that I'm going to pack into 20 minutes for you. And I'm actually going to make it even shorter because I want us to be able to have a discussion afterwards. So first off, let's ask ourselves, what exactly is implicit bias? And I'm going to start this off by playing a video for you. If you've seen this video already, please be quiet, don't talk to your neighbor about it, and on the other side of it, we'll have a bit of a discussion. Sorry about that.
This is a test of selective attention. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball. How many passes did you count? The correct answer is 15 passes. But did you see the gorilla?
Now, how many of you all saw the gorilla? Typically, this test is developed by Daniel Simons and Christopher Chabris. They are both academics in the United States. Half of the time, when they show this video, half of the folks see the gorilla and the other half don't. And so that's really interesting because I think it's a wonderful way to show how our unconscious mind can lead us to see things that we want to see and focus on certain things while not being able to see some of those other things. So bias is a lens through which we see life. But bias is also a systematic error in thinking. While it's a natural human trait and we all have biases, we are no longer in the hunter-gatherer stage. We're no longer choosing spouses based on our means of survival. And so in today's world, it's really an error. Jim Taylor is a PhD at the University of San Francisco, and he puts it best by saying, the biases that helped us survive in primitive times when life was much simpler don't appear to be quite as adaptive in today's much more complex world. So you're probably asking yourselves, if it's a natural human trait, we're all biased, we all adhere to the biases by which we live and grow up, we hold those implicit biases, what can we do to change and shift that? Well, I wanted to look at it from a journalistic perspective, because we're actually held to a higher standard. We actually, when we go out into the field, we're supposed to put our biases on the back shelf somehow and report accurately and be as objective as possible. And of course, we know the main tenets of journalism, objectivity, getting both sides of the story, help us in that. But what are some other ways that we can counteract our biases to get as close to the truth as possible? So I first want to show you a couple of examples of how implicit bias can get in the way for us. So we all know the story Spotlight, right? The Boston Globe uncovered this massive story around sex abuse within the Catholic Church. But early on, there were editors who had been receiving letters and calls and tips for years saying there is sex abuse happening in the church. But those editors were part of the community. They grew up in Boston, born and raised, and so they ignored that part, those stories that they had heard. It wasn't until another editor from the outside came in that that story actually had legs and then began to grow, and they reported on it. There's also the story out of Flint, Michigan, the lead water crisis. So for years, after the state had changed the water system within Flint, Michigan, lead was in the water in high percentages for people. And there's a reporter, Talia Buford, who lived and worked in that community, and she says, I always saw journalism as a way to make a difference by amplifying society's unheard voices. But somewhere along the way, the plights of people in places unknown registered more than those in the place I knew intimately. Now I realize it's easier to swoop into an unfamiliar town and tell someone else's story than it is to recognize the things you've become resigned to in your own life. So what can you do? Well, how many of you all are familiar with Daniel Kahn? He is the author and social scientist who wrote the book Slow Thinking, Fast Thinking. Okay, well, he basically has this idea that our brains work on two frequencies, the fast brain and the slow brain. So our fast brain is automatic, emotional, stereotypic, and subconscious. And our slow brain is logical, calculating, conscious, and thoughtful. Think about your days as a journalist. Which part of the brain are you working most often? What frequency? Oftentimes, it's the fast brain because of tight deadlines. Breaking news, you're often working in that fast brain, that automatic brain. But that's okay, except for when it comes to reporting on things that you're unfamiliar with, or people that you're unfamiliar with. So how can you combat this? How can you get as close to the slow part of your brain, that logical part of your brain, when you're out in the field reporting? So there is this idea called the fishbowl theory. Essentially, think about stories as fish, and think about the environment as the fishbowl. So the fish are, say for instance, the racial tensions on college campuses, the white supremacist rallies, Islamophobia, gentrification. But you think about what made those conditions happen. That is the fishbowl. The fishbowl determines the temperature of the water and the health of the fish within that fishbowl. So if you're reporting on racial tensions on college campuses, the public needs to know the history of racial segregation maybe on that campus, immigration, data, patterns, insights from psychology and sociology, and lived experience. The whole monument issue is a wonderful example of that, specifically talking about, for instance, Captain Cook or Christopher Columbus in the United States and taking down those monuments. Those stories really make no sense, and those rallies make no sense in the context unless you understand the context, unless you understand the history of those monuments and how we came to this point in history. So some key questions to ask yourself that really help you get to covering the entire fishbowl along with the fish. Some key questions are, how did we get here? What do the experts say? And I have a very conflicted idea when it comes to experts. So I work for a national public radio station. We are notorious for using experts for everything, going to Harvard for everything, or going to Stanford to talk to folks. But in cases around context and history, they're very important because many of these folks have spent their entire lives studying a particular issue. What does the data reveal? And of course, you know you have to be careful with data and how the studies are conducted, but it can be very much a great asset. What is the history again? Is the topic of the story part of a pattern, or is it a reaction to it, explained in part by what's happening in the past? And what are the micro and macro elements, and how are those things linked? So you guys know this guy. So he is Ira Glass with This American Life. It is a very popular radio program in the United States and also a podcast. And Ira is very well known for deep narrative type stories. Well, Ira has this thing that he does when he goes out in the field before he heads out to talk with folks. And he calls it, "Say It to My Face." So I was just on a panel, and if many of you all were here, we were talking about checking our biases at the door when we go in to talk with folks, and essentially maybe keeping all of our opinions to ourselves. But really, Ira's idea is that what is the worst thing that you're thinking about your particular subject or idea or event that you're covering? And you need to bring that out into the open. If you're interviewing someone, this is a page in part by investigative reporters, of course, when they're bringing truth to power. So when they're talking to folks and they'll ask them those hard-hitting questions. But you also need to bring up those issues when you're talking with regular folks about everyday issues. Say it to their face. If you have a question, if you're not clear on something, if you're thinking a particular thing, say it to their face, because you actually might get closer to the truth versus just keeping that in the background and not asking those questions. So here are some things, some other tips that I adhere to, and we found to be really great out in the field, and I know many of you all do this just as basic journalists, but you know, you're only as good as your sources. So becoming intentional about your source collection is a great way to not only combat bias, but get a deeper understanding of your community. So every time I interview someone, I always ask them at the end of the interview, who else should I talk to? Who else should I know? And I keep a database of folks that I've already talked to, as well as folks that I would like to talk to or have been recommended to talk to. And that has really diversified my source base. With that, don't become a generalist. So it's very difficult when you're a general assignment reporter. I've been a general assignment reporter for many years, but there's always that one topic that you're the most passionate about. And for me, I was very passionate about education, even though I was covering lots of different things. So I was always the first one to ask to do an education story, keeping up with the latest education news in my community and talking to those sources in my community. So when those stories came up, if there was breaking news around education, I'm the person to go to. I am that slow, logical thinker when it comes to that particular issue, and I can give the most insight on that. And with that, slow down. Intentional analysis on story ideas, interview subjects, and framing your stories during the ideation stage, and talking with people outside of the newsroom. So one thing about news folks, we aren't regular people. No matter what you think, you're not the average Joe. And so it helps to talk with people outside of the newsroom about an idea you have, a particular topic, a source, because those folks get you closer to the community and closer to possibly some of those other ideas that you're not hearing within your newsroom. And check your work for bias on a regular basis. 2 years ago, Adrienne LaFrance with The Atlantic called MIT and had a graduate student there build this analyzing system to help her analyze gender bias in her reporting. And she found that in 1 year, she mentioned over 1,500 men and 500 women, and that 52 of her 136 articles she quoted had no women at all. So checking your work on a regular basis for bias is very helpful. One thing that I started doing after learning about what Adrienne did, I can't have an MIT grad build some sort of system for me, but what I can do is go back and look at my work. And I don't often do it the day after. I'll do it the week after or 2 weeks after, where I have fresh eyes and I'm on to something else. And so I can take a look at that and say, hey, probably I could have done that. I should have talked to this person. Maybe I should have had less of this and more of this. So I want to leave you with a quote by Dr. Jericka Blackman from Stanford University. Diversity is a fact. We all live in a diverse world. Gender diversity, socioeconomic diversity, racial diversity. Inclusion is a practice. You can't have an implicit bias training for a day, for 20 minutes, and then go on out into the world and say, I'm done. You have to every day check yourself, have those markers and those systems in place to help you, because implicit bias is natural. So you have to constantly have a conversation with yourself and practice inclusion. And equity is the goal. So ultimately, we're not talking about equality within your reporting, because that's just, first off, that's not equitable. Equity in your reporting is what you want. You want to get as close to the truth for those folks that you serve as possible. And here is my information if you would like to keep in touch with me. And I also have a slide deck for our longer presentation that I will give to the Walkleys, and they'll send to you an email. But you can also email me and I'll also send it to you. Questions? Let's have some questions now. Yes?
My name's Jodie Chang from the ABC. We have like a lot of organisations with
A mic is coming to you.
Jodie Chang from the ABC. We have like a lot of organisations with diversity policy. Our newsrooms are really white and Anglo and less male than they used to be. But one thing that we have trouble with is retaining staff, actually, and really understanding people's experiences. And also this view, I think, in some of our newsrooms that reporting on their own communities can be quite difficult, particularly when there's not lots of reporters. So we had, I think, one Muslim reporter in our Sydney newsroom who, you know, it's a very difficult time at the moment with extremism, etc., etc. And For her community, it was a massive deal for her to be in that job. And I think she found her obligations to the newsroom and her obligations to the community really difficult to straddle. And I think the newsroom have really unrealistic expectations of her, actually, and not enough sensitivity to understand the situation she was in. And I'm interested to know, maybe from your experience or what you think, the way forward is, a really good way forward, it's constructive, so we keep people and nurture them. And
well, you bring up a really important issue, and one that I feel very passionate about. It's really what led me to this social science and really delving deeper into implicit bias and understanding it, because throughout my career I've always been maybe the only minority in the newsroom or the only African American in the newsroom. And what I found is when we talk about race and identity, all of a sudden these very smart people who are very educated, who over time can report on just about anything at any given notice, they have a problem with it. They can't, they get frozen. And so I actually was in a situation where I was working in a newsroom, and anytime there was any stories about any minorities, not just African Americans, everyone would look to me like, you got this one, Tanya? And that's really why I think we need to take a look at ourselves. What are the things about our past, our history, how we grew up, our social circles that lead us to being so paralyzed when it comes to covering issues of race and identity. And we can't put it all on the minority journalists within our newsroom. We have to become more educated. We have to put ourselves out there. It's a fact. We know this to be true, that when you have people of different races, different cultures, and different socioeconomic standards, then you know that you are much more apt to be able to report on them in a more nuanced way when you're out in the field. So you have to open up your circle, and you can't lean on the minority journalist to be the one to cover those issues. We all have to cover them. Yes.
So I recently did an audit of all the work that I'd done. I'm a
Oh my
digital
gosh,
reporter.
congratulations. That's
Well,
awesome.
no, it's not great because I realised that most of the experts that I speak to are white men,
Yes.
aged between 40 to 60. And I looked at it and I was really shocked because I consider myself quite a, liberal sort of person and, who wants to speak to a whole range of different people. But I found that the reason was because a lot of the women experts that I'd contacted often had other priorities. So if there's other working mums in this room, a lot of them would turn down interviews and say, oh, I can't do it today, but I can do it tomorrow. I've got the kids today, whatever. So I was finding that I've got this kind of skew towards contacting men just because they always seem to be more available than women, because women seem to have all of these extra responsibilities. Have you found that yourself that you have a bias that you've had to work on and try and fix in your own reporting that surprised you?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I still commend you for auditing yourself, because now that you've seen it, you can't unsee it, right? You know where your bias is in that regard, and you can work on that. I have found that to be the case. There are some minority communities that I report on that they don't respond in the timeline of my deadline, but I always mark it that I need to contact them after the story, because sometimes it's about building relationships. So once I have a relationship with those groups, then they know, okay, when I call, they will answer my call. Or if I know that I'm doing stories on that I want to have female experts, I will plan just a little bit beforehand. Okay, so if I know tomorrow I'm on a story that I really want to have a woman on, I will call her at 8 o'clock at night and say, hey, I'm going to call you tomorrow. What does your day look like? Do you think you can squeeze me in the time between getting off work and going to get your child? That would be wonderful. And it's just important. You're going to have to, that whole idea of inclusion is a practice. You're going to have to practice. You're going to have to set, maybe reporting in a different way than you reported before. Yes, here in the back and then over here. Oh, great.
Thanks for your talk, Tanya. One of the things I've come across recently in my writing groups is that some women with lived experience, say of disability or of a certain ethnicity, are saying, we don't want anybody else writing about our stuff. We don't think that somebody, for example, who isn't a domestic violence survivor should be writing about these issues. So, I mean, that's not actually something I necessarily agree with. But then on the other hand, you know, a person with a disability can bring a very, very powerful voice to an issue that perhaps an able-bodied person couldn't. So I just wonder what your view would be on that, given that you're telling us all to kind of check our biases and go out and report into these areas that we're not so comfortable in, perhaps.
You bring up an important issue within marginalized communities. When you haven't had a voice for very long and you have a chance to give your voice, you want to be the one to bring that voice alive. But at the same time, that's not always the case. So I think about when you talk specifically about other people reporting on, say, disability or women's issues, this idea of this anthropological view is often the issue. Because when we do go out there, it's like, hey, look at this population. This is what they do, and this is what, versus having a more nuanced view. And it takes doing more and more of those stories, and what I was saying earlier about having a deeper understanding, and that only comes with interfacing with those groups, that you can report on those stories in that way. And so what they're responding to is that anthropological view in the past, and then their now ability to be able to tell their own stories. And it's very important that both those things happen. Yes.
Hi, my name's Jo. I edit a magazine called Inside Retail. So I obviously cover the retail industry. Great industry, I should add. It's just that it's overrun, not overrun is not the right word. It's just that there's a lot of old white dudes at the top of the you know, when it comes to boards. So they're all at the high levels. And all the women tend to be on the shop floor. So inherently in my job, I already struggle to cover, you know, both men and women, simply because the industry itself already has an issue with gender diversity. And I haven't even come to ethnic diversity at this stage. So I came into this role about a year ago. So, you know, one of the things I wanted to do was to highlight some of the great things that a lot of the women have done. But my concern is when does it become about being inclusive? When does it become... I'm a bit concerned that it ends up looking like a tokenistic gesture, because I end up trying to think of story ideas that will include women, as opposed to, you know, necessarily like people who, you know, really hate using the word, but people who might be of who might just happen to be white men. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are in terms of making it, you know, just a general practice rather than being a tokenistic gesture where every International Women's Day we write something up, blah blah blah, and that's, you got women covered. Does that make
Absolutely,
sense?
absolutely. First off, thinking about who's the best person to talk to about a particular story. That's still first and foremost like the most important thing. But oftentimes we're searching for the person who knows a lot and also can meet our deadline. And so when those two things are at play, that's when we often find ourselves, that's the fast thinking part of our brains. That's when we're also just working to fill our deadline and we fall into those traps. I do believe, though, that we have to work harder to find diverse sources so that when those times come, we can get those best people to speak in stories, not about being a woman, but hey, being about the latest issue within the garment industry or something like that. And there are those folks out there. You just have to work a little bit harder to investigate, to find them and build relationships with them, so then when the time comes, you can give them a call and you know that they're well versed on the issue.
Hi, I was just wondering if I could build on that.
Yes.
I have a bit of a different background from probably a lot of people in the room, because I'm not actually in journalism. I work for the Museum of Australian Democracy in Canberra. And one of the challenges that we face, and this is, whether it's a question, I don't know, it's more sort of building on a comment, but you might have an insight, is that we are a building which has historically been occupied almost entirely by white men. Our job is to tell the story of democracy, but for a lot of Australia's history, that was old white men in suits sitting around talking about how they could help old white men in suits. And we've recently discovered that, particularly on things like our social feeds, stories about women, stories about Indigenous people, always do really, really well. So the kind of stories that we produce are not journalistic stories, but they're still important stories to tell. I'm just wondering if you had any sort of insights into that area. How do you? You're right in that the last question was right, that it can seem tokenistic. When your subject is something that's so massively dominated by white men throughout all of history, what's the trick into making that inclusive without actually forgetting some of the subject?
You gotta get more diverse people in there. You can't be sitting in a room with all white men, as brilliant as they are, and have them write, honestly, because, and then have them writing consistently about women's issues and issues around minority diversity, that kind of stuff. So I'm kind of like talking out of two sides of my mouth, because the woman here asked me about being able to have folks at the table to write about their own experiences. But really, more so, it's about diversity and thought and life experience and bringing that to the table and being able to build a richness in that. Does that answer your question?
Sort of. I should point out that we're not dominated by white men now. We're housed in a building that was the Parliament building.
Was, yeah.
So most of the Parliament, for most of the time it was there, was nothing but white men. It's different now, but our museum staff is quite diverse. I think it's actually more women than men. But the challenge is the stories that we tell are about things that happened in our building and the things that have happened through Australian history, which is dominated by white men. There are lots of stories that we could tell, but the challenge is telling those stories in a way that sort of brings something new.
It's a challenge across the world, right? The United States is dealing with that. A lot of people are this idea of revisionist history, or this idea of taking a look at history and taking a look at from the people's view. So a people's history on that. It's a really hard thing, but it's right now, I feel like we're at the tipping point when it comes to this issue. That's what we're seeing with the monument issue all across the United States, and even to some degree here in Australia. So I know I'm not answering your question, but I'm saying that we're getting there. We're like at this point where I think the answers will become clear. Yes.
I guess this builds on a few of those comments, but when I've examined my own biases, I've really looked at some of the reasons why I've gone for this instead of that. One of them is time.
Yeah.
One of them is quick, I've just got to pick one, and I go with comfort. I go, I know this sort of even stereotype of that person, so I go there. And the second one is, if it's, say, a subject that I know nothing about, and there are those cultural complexities, and I feel like that's just so over my head, I actually feel like a lot of the working environment, we've got to be right, and we've got to know what we're talking about, and we've got to come across like, we've got this, and we're doing our research. But if things are quite large, we almost don't want to reach out to our peers even and say, I'm actually feeling really stupid, and I don't know what I'm doing in this environment. I feel like we're so afraid of making a mistake, so it's better to go with the known than the unknown. And I don't know if you have the answer to that, but I'm just saying, on those tight deadlines, I almost wish there was more space to explore those issues and go, how can I get outside my own comfort zone with this? Without going, well, you've got to get it by 4 o'clock. So
Right. So I'll answer this really quickly, and then I think they're going to take the broom and like sweep me off. But you know what? We aren't perfect all of the time, but I'll give you an example of an issue that I'm personally dealing with. So now I'm in the Silicon Valley, and in the South Bay, there's a heavy Hispanic population, and I know very basic Spanish. And it's something I feel very insecure about. And I've already encountered stories that are great, rich stories that I can't get at because I don't know the language well enough. And it's very easy for me to say, okay,
there was a particular story I was working on. Okay, you know what? I'm just going to do the absolute least, talk to this person who's an English speaker, and then move along. And in fact, I did do a variation of that for that story because of my deadline, but I've already committed to myself that I'm taking Spanish again so that I can learn it, so that I can have those conversations with that community, because it's important. It's the part of the community that I cover. And also, I've already asked my boss, is there a way, when I'm doing this deeper investigative work, which I'll be working on a series involving this community, that I have a translator with me? And so I now will have that translator while I'm working on my Spanish. So if you don't get it right at your deadline, you should definitely put a marker for yourself to come back to it and get as educated as possible on the issue so that then the next time it comes up, you'll feel a little more confident. Thank you all for having me.